Hello, my name is Julie, and today I'm going to be talking about all the books that I read in October. I feel like I open all of these wrap-ups with, this was a weird reading month. It didn't feel like a weird reading month, but the couple of things that were different than usual were, one, I read more modern classics than usual. I read 4 books that were published in the 1900s as opposed to usually maybe 1 a month. I also read more books off of my physical TBR than in any month this year, which is great to be getting some stuff off my shelves, but unfortunately, if I keep all of my star ratings down to the quarter at exactly what they are right now, this will be tied with the lowest rated month of the year. That's not great, but I feel like what happened here is I just had a lot of books that felt like they were in the 3-star range for me, which, shrug. So really quick, let's go through my stats for the month before I talk about all of the books that I read. So in October, I read 12 books for a total of 4,746 pages. That book count is about average, and that page count is a little bit above average. I have an average rating of a 3.38, which is significantly below my average, again, tied for worst of the year. And I have one book that I think I'm giving a 5-star. Average page count of the books was 395.5, with me reading about 153 pages a day. I read 7 books for my TBR. I hauled 2 books to my TBR and did not unhaul any. So that means I have an annual net TBR shelf of -14. That's ridiculous. I have felt like I bought a lot of books this year too, so I don't know what's up with that. Star ratings, as you can see, we were dominated by 3 stars this month. On to the pie charts. A good mix of genres, but mystery, thriller, horror did take it, which makes sense because spooky season, followed by fantasy with 25% of my reads. I did read mostly standalones, but when I did read series, I only read sequels and conclusions, which is awesome. As usual, I read 1/3 of my books on audio and the rest were physical, and I only read 1 young adult book. Let's get into our reviews. So the first book that I read this month was The Night We Lost Him by Laura Dave. This was an ARC that was sent to me by the publisher Mary Sue Ritchie Books. So this actually came out, I believe, on October 1st. This is about our main character, Nora, whose father is this like hotel resort magnate. He's had many families throughout his life, but he has done a very good job like keeping the peace, keeping those people separate, and being there for each of his families individually, and nobody really hates him. He ends up dying at one of his houses, falling off of a cliff. The police immediately rule out foul play, but Nora's stepbrother does not. He believes that something happened that night, and he ropes Nora into it. Meanwhile, every once in a while, we get flashbacks to their father Liam's life through the decades, his relationship with someone. So this was pitched as a suspense novel, so I knew it wasn't really going to be that much of a mystery or thriller, but I wanted more from this book. I felt like we got pretty bare bones when it came to our characters. I wasn't invested in Nora or her stepbrother at all. Nora has a plot going on where she has an ex-boyfriend who's still in her life, and she has a fiance. She wants to be with her fiance, but she wants to like still have this ex in her life, and like that plot, not interesting to me. Then there's the backstory of the dad, where we are seeing him have a relationship with this woman over the course of decades, and they were never really officially together or anything. Will they, won't they? But we know they won't because he's already dead. That plot, I did not feel emotionally attached to at all. It felt like every single one of these chapters, the 2 characters would have the exact same conversations. He's like, well, why don't you want to be with me? And she's like, because I don't want to be with you like that. And like, they never really saw, I don't feel like it's that much of a spoiler to say they never really solve their problems. It doesn't feel like there's character development. So what was the point of having these backstories? It's not 300 pages and the text is huge and there's a lot of these blank pages. So this book is super short. So to me, the only thing really pushing me through this was a little bit of the mystery, and it is very basic. there's not a whole lot of layers to it, because the pull of this book is supposed to be that emotional bit and not the mystery, and the emotional bit didn't get me. So this was just a 3 for me. I wish that this had built itself up a lot more and tried to expand on its characters, because that's what it wanted the focus to be, but there wasn't anything I was mad about. Then I read one of the final books on my 20 books to read in 2024 TBR, and that was Death Valley by Melissa Broader. I think it was 2 years ago I read Milk Fed by Melissa Broader, and that felt like a very formative experience to me. So I was really excited when this came out. This was her 2023 release. I picked it up basically as soon as I could get my hands on it and just didn't get around to it till now. This is about a writer whose father is in a coma. There's a very good chance that he could die. Her husband has like some sort of strange chronic illness that has not been figured out. She's also struggling to try to help him as well. And so she decides, because she has been thinking that her dad is going to die the next day for months, she goes to the desert and starts trying to write her novel. This is not even 250 pages, and it is about her being in the desert, go on hikes in the desert, finding things along the way, like getting lost, thinking about the different situations, about the people who are ailing in her life. I knew that this was going to be a little bit of a weird book because of what I read in Milk Fed, but I didn't quite know what kind of weird. This kind of just feels like it's more of the whole thing's a metaphor, keeping these a little bit vague sort of thing. I kind of wish this went a little bit further. I don't know. I didn't feel as attached to this story and this character as I did with Milk Fed. The very beginning of this book is pretty weird, and then it sort of stays more realistic than it started. So I feel like this book almost like faked me out on what the back half of it was gonna feel like. I don't know. I didn't feel particularly attached to it, but I can see how this like big extended metaphor would work for somebody. I think I just wasn't the particular reader for it. So this is again like in the 3 range. There was nothing here that I thought went wrong. It just didn't really hit me. Then I decided to listen to 100 Years of Solitude by Gabriel Garcia Marquez. This is a modern classic. It's supposed to be one of like the best Spanish language books of all time. It is a classic of magical realism and the Hispanic, Latin American tradition of magical realism. This is about the Buendia family. We follow them through multiple generations. They go into wartime and peacetime, and we see through the generations how the same traits of the people keep getting recycled through the generations. This was a strange one. I listened to this on audio, and that was a mistake. Do not listen to this book on audio. You will not know who is who. I did not know going into the book, but this book is well known for having a million characters that all have the same couple of names, so it's pretty hard to keep them straight. Most copies of the book have a family tree in it for you to actually keep it straight. There's Jose Arcadio Buendia, there's Arcadio Buendia, there's Jose Buendia, then there's Arcadio Jose, I'm pretty sure. Because people are literally naming people after each other, there's just a million people that have the same name. So that definitely did not make it easy for me to fully get it, but by the end of the book, I felt like I had all the balls in the air. So this ends up pulling a lot from Marquez's Colombian family, and he had an ancestor who was in the Thousand Days War, and a lot of the turmoil of the time. I'm going to say sometimes you read a book and you don't like it, but you get it. You understand what it's trying to do, but that doesn't mean you like it. This book was not that case for me. This book I did not understand. Maybe if I read this book in like a school setting, I would get what it was about. There's so much incest in this book. It's like, it's about like cycles. It's about how these people cannot escape the cycles set for them by their ancestors because they never actually try to leave them. There's so many like prophecies that are supposed to be about the Buendia family and the rise and the fall, and even the first sentence of the book is about how somebody in the Buendia family dies from a firing squad. Just about like fatalism and how like everything is going to crash and burn by the end of it. But like, I don't think I fully got this. This is like a type of storytelling that doesn't really work for me. And actually another book that I read this month kind of felt similarly, in that it's very anecdotal. We will have a single story about one character, and then we're going to move to a different single story about a different character, different, and it doesn't feel like there's not a full overarching plot. And because it is about like generations, it makes me feel disconnected from it. I didn't really feel for any of these characters or sort of the storyline, because they are just like these really exaggerated characters and these stories are so small. You get to know somebody through one thing that they did. So that just like was not a thing that worked for me. I just don't think I got this book. Obviously this is like one of the most celebrated works of fiction in the world, and I just don't get why. There were a lot of times that I went back to sort of check that I heard everything right and I didn't miss anything. This book has a lot of incest in it, and I didn't understand it. I guess if this is like a part of the fatalism of like these people are like dooming themselves by doing incest, but it was just so much of the book. It's just a really weird experience that I was not guided through, and maybe if I had this in like a school setting, I would have gotten a little bit more out of this one, but I just don't think this one's for me. I am going to be giving this a 2-star. I feel bad when I give classics bad ratings because I feel like it's a me, not them thing, but I don't know. Then I did a reading vlog this month, and that was reading the most popular and most rated 5-star books on my Goodreads TBR. And if you would like to watch that vlog, you can catch that right here before I talk about my reviews. But the first book that I read in that video was The Guest List by Lucy Foley. This is a mystery thriller about a wedding of 2 minor celebrities on a small Irish island in the middle of a storm. And we know that by the end of the wedding, somebody will have died, but we don't know who it is, and we don't know who's done it, and we're trying to figure out the whole way. We see from the perspective of the bride, the wedding planner, the best man, the maid of honor, and one of the plus ones, as we are jumping from perspective to perspective, jumping from the past and the present, trying to put together who's gonna die and who's going to kill them. I read The Paris Apartment earlier this year and heard bad things about it, but had a ton of fun with it. And then I read this book, heard such great things about it, and I thought it was just okay. So now I'm kind of thinking, if everybody read The Guest List first and loved it, and then read The Paris Apartment after that and didn't really like it, is Lucy Foley so formulaic that people just like the first Lucy Foley they read and then not the second one? Lucy Foley for sure knows how to write an engaging book. She knows how to make it popcorn, you know, leave you on a cliffhanger on the chapter. I felt like this did a lot of similar things to The Paris Apartment. I felt like there were very similar character tropes that we were going through. I felt like it was really obvious who our murder victim was going to be from like pretty early on. It didn't surprise me because I knew where the plot twists were going to be. Like I was like, oh, I know that something's going to happen about this character's past that's related to this item. I might not have gotten exactly what the plot twist was, but I had, you know, colored in the area around it enough that when it was actually revealed, it wasn't that surprising. And I did end up guessing who the killer was pretty easily. I thought that the setting was pretty fun for this. It feels a little bit gothic that we're in this like really stormy area. I just didn't have a lot of attachment to any one of our characters to keep me glued as much as I was to The Paris Apartment. And having like a 3-star actually makes a good amount of sense, because when you actually look at the stats that put this onto my list, it was the most read book on my Goodreads TBR, but it was only the number 10 in the amount of 5 stars it got. So it wasn't that common that people were giving it 5 stars. Maybe it was more of a 4-star for people. There were just more things that surprised me with The Paris Apartment versus this felt very classic interpersonal relationship mystery thriller, if that makes sense. And I am comparing them so much because I feel like they are trying to execute pretty similar things. So I am giving this in the realm of the 3-star, 3.25, something like that. Okay, I have fixed the lighting. So our next book is The Hating Game by Sally Thorne. I keep wanting to call her Lucy Foley because that was the previous book I read, and this main character is Lucy, and she is played by a Lucy. So this is about Lucy and Josh, and they are executive assistants at a publishing firm that came from two different publishing houses merging. These two butt heads a lot. They're constantly teasing each other and undermining each other and making everything a competition between the two of them. And now that a promotion is opening up for one of the two of them to be the other one's boss, they are at odds again. But of course, they're actually really, really attracted to each other. Even though I had a lot of problems with this book, I had a lot of fun. They kind of balance each other out. I think that Josh definitely has some controlling aspects to him. He kind of does a bit of negging in this book that is not cool and isn't addressed by the book. I think Josh, just by the end of the book, kind of does take accountability for some of his actions and straight up apologizes. That's cool. However, I do think he just has a little bit of control to him over Lucy's life that isn't totally cool, especially when they aren't even in a relationship yet. Like, you're manipulating someone before they even get into a relationship with you? That's not cool. But this had fun rom-com aspects. I think the writing of this was very edible. It like made me want to continue reading. There were some fun rom-com aspects to it of like, there's a paintball fight. There is that promotion competition that people are working towards. There's a time where somebody's taking care of somebody when they're sick. Like there was a fun plot stuff. So I kind of had fun making fun of this book as much as I had fun with the book itself. So I am giving this a 3.5. It definitely doesn't deserve to be the number 2 5-starred book on my TBR, but I had fun enough. And the third book that I read for that vlog definitely does deserve to be the number 1 most 5-starred book that I have on my TBR, and that is I'm Glad My Mom Died by Jeanette McCurdy. This is a memoir about how her mother impacted her life even after she died. So this starts when Jeanette is 6 years old and her mother is pushing her into the child actor industry because her mother wanted to be a child actor. Jeanette has no interest in acting. She just wants to do what makes her mother happy because even though Jeanette is the youngest, she is sort of the parentified child whose anxieties are so attuned to her mother's frequently changing moods. It is just really difficult to read about this hostile environment that she grew up in, especially as her mother makes her kids live in like not a safe household, how she abuses her children. Never physically assaulting her children, but doing just about everything else, including one of the most long-lasting things that happened to Jeanette of giving her an eating disorder. Even after her mother passes away, we see Jeanette through the years as she is laboring under the weight that her mother gave to her and trying to unlearn those behaviors. So we skip through a good amount of her life. If you're looking for this to be about her time in children's TV and on Nickelodeon, like this is not it. It is about Jeanette's personal life, and this book would totally stand up on its own were Jeanette not famous. And I think that this is such a timely memoir, as it is a very common thing right now for people to be doing deconstructing about the lessons that their parents taught them that might not be so healthy. I think Jeanette McCurdy did so much work on herself to be able to get to the point of being able to write this book and write with such clarity about why the things that happened were bad and how you can see how that interacted with her later. This definitely has a lot of trigger warnings for eating disorders, so if that is something that would upset you to read, this would be one to skip, but I highly, highly recommend this if this is the sort of content you can read. I don't feel super great rating this book. This is the book that I would consider to possibly be the 5-star that I gave out this month, but I just don't feel right assigning a rating to this book. I think this should at least be rounded to a 5-star, if not being a 5-star. I don't know, I just don't like rating nonfiction because it's something that I don't read a lot, especially because I'm not a memoir person. This is one of very few memoirs that I've read in my life, but at this moment, 5-star. Next up, I read Razorblade Tears by S.A. Cosby. This is a revenge thriller about 2 men whose sons were married to each other and were killed extremely violently. These two dads, one of them who's black, one of them who's white, neither of them really ever accepted their sons in life. Both of them have had checkered pasts. They have decided to go back to that checkered past to try to figure out who did this to their sons. And along the way, they have this journey, having conversations with themselves and questioning these long-held beliefs of theirs. This does a really good job of talking about how the Black community is a lot of the times opposed very strongly to the gay community, as our main character is a Black man who is so repulsed by this idea of his son being gay, so much that he had talked to him for so long. But now that he's dead, he's like, I would rather my son be alive and gay than dead. This is really propulsive. It was also way bloodier than I thought it was gonna be. Like this, I would put this like bordering on slasher territory. It mostly surprised me, not because of the synopsis, but because this was a book of the month pick. And I'm not disappointed by that at all. I'm not saying that they shouldn't pick books like this. I just, based on what they normally have, this felt surprising. I thought this did a very good job of having our main characters reckon with their own prejudices, while also being a revenge thriller of trying to track these people who knew their sons down, finding out what happened to them. And I thought the ending was very fitting for the type of stuff that happened in this book. If this sounds like something that would be interesting to you, I did think that it executed on this premise really well, so I am giving this a strong 4-star. Then I listened to Lightbringer by Claire Legrand. This is the third and final book in the Imperium trilogy. I thought that this was a YA series, and I'm thinking that it's considered kind of like new adult. In this world, there are two prophesized queens that will shift the fate of the world. One of them is the Sun Queen, who will bring peace and prosperity, and the other is the Blood Queen, who will bring death and destruction. 1,000 years apart, we follow Riel, who is in this more like medieval type setting in this world where magic does exist, and we're finding out in the first book that she's a very powerful magician, and she's doing all these trials to find out if she's the Sun Queen. But we know by the end of her life she is going to be known as the Blood Queen. And we also follow Eliana, who lives 1,000 years later and lives in a world without magic that feels a little bit more urban. She sort of takes care of herself, hunts down bad guys, that sort of thing. We know that she is actually the daughter of the woman from 1,000 years ago, just brought into the future by magic. Really enjoyed the first book in the series. I think I gave it like a 4.5. The second book I read only like 2 months later, maybe 3, which is unheard of for me. I usually wait a while between books. That one let me down. I was not nearly as invested in that book as I was the first book, and this book I felt pretty similarly. I was never as invested in our main characters as I was in the first book, and it's hard to pin down why. I think there were some pacing issues in this book. There were like character decisions that I just didn't love, and I felt like we jump around a whole lot, especially between characters who aren't our main two characters, so it's kind of taking away from their arcs. I mean, the character that I do care about the most in this series is Audric, and we just don't get nearly as much Audric content as I'd like. I think that this has some interesting fantasy flavors, like we're talking about angels, and there's also time travel involved with those two different timelines. There's not a lot of jumping back and forth, but like that element is there, and we know these two storylines, even though they're far apart, are very much connected. And that's something that was interesting, but like the further I went in the series, like the less I cared about these characters and the more flimsy this world felt. I've seen a lot of people complain online about the ending of this book. To me, this felt very appropriate for the type of book that this was setting itself up to be. I think that this is the sort of thing that you could have sort of seen coming just from the premise of the book. This feels like a fitting ending. So that wasn't necessarily my problem. I just felt like a lot of the stuff felt one-dimensional, not as thought out as maybe the author wants you to believe. I don't think I really gained anything by finishing out the series rather than DNFing it, but I've really been trying to make a point of finishing or DNFing series this year, so I got another one off of my shelf. And there was another Claire Legrand book that came out during the series that I absolutely hated, so there might be a good chance that I don't read another Claire Legrand book. Then, the book that I was reading for most of this month, I read Catch-22 by Joseph Heller. This is a modern classic that is about World War II. It is set in Italy, where a group of American fighter pilots are in a situation where they have flown the number of missions that they have been required to fly to go home, and the people in charge keep arbitrarily increasing the number of missions that they're supposed to fly to be able to go home. So nobody is being sent home, even though there are reserves of people who could come help them. The people in charge are just doing it to fuel their own egos because they're not the people who are actually flying the planes. And our main character, Yossarian, is trying to get out of flying by claiming insanity. The only problem is that there is a catch called Catch-22 that says that for a person to claim insanity, they have to claim it themselves. And a person who claims that they are crazy because they are afraid of flying cannot be crazy because it is sane to be afraid of flying. So nobody is allowed to be sent home for insanity. When I mentioned to anybody in my real life that this book is what I was reading, without exception, everybody who had read this book went, ugh, that book. So many people have had a problem getting through this book, and I totally understand why. I'm gonna be honest, I didn't enjoy my reading experience until maybe the last 100 pages. I think that this book is really tough. Maybe an adaptation of this book would be more easily receptible because of the type of humor and satire this book is talking about. This book very much relies on who's on first type humor and doing that ad nauseum. It is very much supposed to be frustrating, it is supposed to be redundant, and we are not supposed to be feeling like we're getting anywhere for the majority of the book. And that is massively frustrating. And this is, like I said about 100 Years of Solitude, written very anecdotally, where each chapter will follow a different character who's doing something nonsensical, because that's the point of the book. And I felt like a lot of those nonsensical anecdotes didn't need to be there. I didn't feel like this was as tightly written as it could have been. Unlike 100 Years of Solitude, where I didn't know what this was going for, I absolutely get what this book is going for. That doesn't mean I enjoyed every second of it. The first 350 pages of this book, I was really not enjoying my experience. A lot of the humor didn't necessarily land with me. There's a lot of blatant sexism, which I'm sure is supposed to be satirical, but it's like constant, and there's no women characters that we follow, so it's not like they ever really get any depth to them. But like all the characters are supposed to be satirical, but all the women are just sex objects for the most part until the end of the book. And it's really hard to grapple with what to do with that because yes, it's supposed to be satire, but that is so close to what the actual opinions of actual people were at this time. So it doesn't feel satirical. And I do think that in the last 100 pages, 1, we have a little bit more of a plot. 2, we get a little bit more development of our main character as he's sort of like getting ground under his tires. He's actually getting some grip. That last 100 pages felt vastly different to me than the first 350. I usually try to read 100 physical pages a day, but while I was reading this, I could only read like a maximum, force myself to read like 25, maybe 50 pages a day. I just didn't want to continue reading, and even though I know what it's going for and I can understand the literary significance of it, doesn't mean I had a ton of fun with it. But those 100 pages really are making me question how I feel about this book and what I want to rate it. After complaining to anyone who could hear it about how I wasn't having fun with this book, I do think it ended up pulling off some great stuff towards the end. So I do think it was worth finishing the book. it just really took a lot out of me. Then I read Lair of Dreams by Libba Bray. This is the second book in the Diviner series, which is a YA historical fantasy horror series that is set in the 1920s in New York City, as we have a bunch of different teen protagonists who are all interacting with different things about the reality of 1920s New York, like dealing with protests at the time, or anti-Semitism or racism or whatever. In the first book, there is a set of murders that is happening, and our main character, Evie, she has the magical ability that she can read an object's past if she touches it, and she ends up helping out investigate that murder. This book follows most of the main characters along with a couple of new ones, and now there are a couple of people who have the ability to walk in dreams. They can interact with other people's dreams. Some people can interact with the dead through their own dreams. There is a dream sickness that has been sweeping the city, where people are going to sleep and not waking up, and more often than not dying in their sleep. I thought that this was a really solid follow-up. I do think that in this one I was more invested in the historical elements than maybe the fantasy horror plot. I think the horror plot of book one was so strong. Like, it felt like maybe like a Stephen King book or something like that. I think there were a lot of good themes here of our characters learning some really harsh realities. There were some characters that weren't the focus that I would have liked to see more from, but I did like the two main characters that we follow in this one, Henry and Ying. I think the series just does a really good job of confronting a lot of the not pretty stuff about this time in American history, how like people see the glitz and the glamour of the 1920s and don't really want to look at the stuff underneath. So it's also got that like educational bit of talking about like the Chinese Exclusion Act and stuff like that, and I think that this just does a great job doing what it's setting out to do. So this is a really solid 4-star for me, maybe a 4.25. I did like book one more than I like this one, but not a significant amount, so I will definitely be continuing on in this series. Then I read The Twisted Throne by Danielle L. Jensen. This is the 5th book in the Bridge Kingdom series that is 6 books split into 3 duologies, each of the duologies following a different couple. In the very first book, we are following Lara, who is a princess trained to be an assassin, and she ends up sacrificing her own freedom to let her sisters live their lives and have her marry this enemy king so that she will assassinate him and help bring resources to her country. Things have gone on from there, of course, and in this book, we are following Anna, who is the sister of the king from the first books, as she has been betrothed since she was young to the crown prince of another country called Harendel, and her brother does not want to force her to marry this man, but she feels very obligated to do what she thinks is the thing that will be the most useful to her country, which is really struggling to make ends meet. She ends up getting picked up to go to this country by the crown prince's bastard brother, and she ends up being quite attracted to the bastard brother, goes and meets up with the crown prince that she's supposed to be with, and neither of them really like the other. She comes from a country where there's not really court politics. People have a lot of individual freedoms, versus Harendel, it's very court politicky, something that Anna, who is a great warrior, has really not a lot of tools to deal with, and she is constantly trying not to be caught in traps. We also follow James, who's that bastard brother, who he is the favored of his father. His mother was from a country that his countrymen really despise. He's like trying to help the nation of his mother's birth. Even though these two really like each other, they don't know how much they are at odds with each other in their actual political goals, because they're not talking to each other. They don't know if they can trust each other. I really liked the politics in this book. I think that's where the strongest suit of this was, even though I thought that this was a lot more derivative and a lot more conventional than the other Bridge Kingdom books. All 5 of the Bridge Kingdom books have kind of been set in different places than the others, and this one was the most derivative of a real historical period in a way that a lot of other books have already done. So it just felt not new. And there also felt like there was a bit of a pacing problem to me. There felt like there was so little that happened for so much of this book. And then at the end, we just had like what felt like a Sanderlanche. Like it felt like it was just plot, 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 plot. Like it was just plot twist, plot twist, plot twist. Like just so many different revelations coming together, some that the reader was privy to and the characters weren't, and some that were entirely new to the reader. And I thought that that ending really, really saved this book for me. Like, I thought that that actually made the political stuff like so worth the read. However, this is a fantasy romance. I did not buy the romance of this book at all. I did not get the chemistry between these characters remotely. Like, the first scene that they have together is such a cool fantasy situation plot to be in. And it's like, oh, we can be fun and flirty in this situation. And then every other part of it just felt like it was so based on that kind of like insta love. The other two romances in this series, I was immediately on board for each of the individual characters and invested in them. And I was invested in the two of them being together. And I was invested in all of the different things that were keeping them apart. I cannot say any of those things for these characters. I felt like James is a really weak protagonist. Like, he just doesn't have a lot going for him. He felt really white bread. Anna is okay. She's kind of got that main character syndrome thing of like just being so stubborn that she will do the opposite of whatever you tell her to do in a way that felt really immature. And I do think that that is very purposeful on the part of the author, that she's supposed to feel like that. I just did not care about her characters the way that I did in her other books. The political fantasy plot in here was still fairly up to par with her other stuff. The romance did not do it for me at all. So I am debating whether I should give this like a 3.5 or a 4, because that ending was so ridiculously strong that it just made up for the whole book being like a 3-ish. We'll figure it out. And the last book that I read this month was I wanted to read a murder mystery for Halloween, so I picked up my grandmother's copy of Agatha Christie's Mrs. McGinty is Dead. She gave this to me years ago, and I have just never picked it up for like no reason. I read several Agatha Christie's in high school, and then 0 in college, and only now am I picking up a couple again. And this is supposed to be the book that ushers the final stage of Poirot in, basically with the addition of Ariadne Oliver, who is a writer of detective mystery novels, which is very much a caricature of Agatha Christie herself. In this book specifically, this mild-mannered woman named Mrs. McGinty, who was in her 60s, she was a cleaner lady for other people's houses, and she was murdered in her own home, and her lodger at the time was implicated in the crime because it seemed like he was the only person who could have done it. But the policeman who was in charge of it reaches out to Poirot and is like, hey, I don't think he did it. This guy's set to hang. Can you help out? He starts investigating the different people in the village. I haven't read that many Poirot, and it's been a long time since I read those first couple Poirot that I read, but this felt different to me than a lot of Poirot that I had read, and I looked it up, and that is the general consensus about this book. It is a, quote, village mystery, which is usually what Agatha Christie would reserve for a Miss Marple book. I have read one, but that was forever ago. This definitely felt more insular and tame than a lot of the other Poirot books. To me, the best part of this was like the humor in this book. Poirot complaining about his poor living conditions was quite funny, and then also Ariadne Oliver. This is the first major appearance of her in the series, and you can kind of tell she is talking about her character, who is a parody of Poirot. There is a man who is trying to do an adaptation of one of her books as a play, and he's trying to change everything, and she's getting so upset about it. So it was really funny because it was very clearly Agatha Christie, like, doing a parody of herself. I think the mystery was good, but I didn't feel like I was really tied to it as much. I definitely felt like I couldn't keep track of all of these characters because they didn't feel like they necessarily had as many defining characteristics as maybe some of her other books. The major plot twist of this definitely got me, and I really liked the bait and switch that she sort of did. This one was good, but not up there in the most memorable Agatha Christie's. It's not one of her more known titles for a reason, but I still had a good time with it, so I'm probably gonna give it a 3.5. And as the light is dying, those are all the books that I read this month. I would love to know what you read in October, what you thought about them. If you've read any of these books, I'd love your thoughts. If you would like to find me anywhere, you can find me at the link in the description to everything I do on the internet. And if you want to see more of my videos, you can hit that subscribe button. And as always, I will see you in the next one.